Let's just quickly create our remaining two road sections by duplicating our original one. So duplicate the first one, Control H to hide, and that was Control D to duplicate, and that's road 3. We are going to assign a new material, Lambert. We'll call this road middle Lambert, and we will add another file node, select our middle texture, and there we go. So let's just save. Control D to duplicate, and we're going to call this one land infill, because this is going to be sitting under our buildings. Hydro 2, Control H, with land infill, assign new material, Lambert, call it land infill Lambert, and this time instead of adding a bitmap, we'll just switch to 2D textures. We're going to add a noise, and here we can just choose our parameters. So I'm just going to go into color, reduce our default color down, color offset, start to bring it down. So as well as the color picker, we can just also use these sliders as well, and just play about until you get something that you're happy with. Just reduce this down quite a bit more, that's better. And now in our place 2D texture, we can now switch this to be smaller by, in repeat UV, placing both values to 4. Congratulations, everything is now built, and we can now start. Select our land infill object, move to the mesh shelf, and press this icon here, which is create mesh network. And all of a sudden we see 10 clones of our land geo object. Adding a mesh network creates 2 new objects in the outliner. The first is the mesh1 object. When selected, this acts as the brain of the mesh network, where nodes are added which are similar to adding cloners and MoGraph effectors in Cinema 4D. The second object is the mesh1 repro mesh. This is the actual geometry that mesh1 creates and is adjusted on the fly. As we can see, the original land infill object has been hidden. So when the mesh geometry is selected in the viewport, it is the mesh1 repro mesh that is being selected. Fundamentally, this isn't too different from what's happening when a cloner is added in Cinema 4D, but it is a different way of doing things. To access the mesh1 node, select it in the outliner. In the attribute editor, there are 3 tabs. There is the mesh1 tab, where nodes, the direct equivalent of MoGraph effectors, are added. The second tab is a distribute node. The distribute node is like Cinema 4D's cloner and matrix object wrapped into one. The final tab is the repro node. This is where we can see what geometry we have added to our mesh network. Here we can see our land infill object, and also what order it is in, which matters especially when we have the ID node attached, but we'll be looking at that in more depth later. Let's look at the distribute node, so that we can create the large ground plane we need. In the distribution type, let's switch this to grid. Let's close our linear options and move to our grid options, and let's just bring our object in. We need to change the distance in X and Z to 4, and we want 5 and 5 in our grid. There we go. We can see all our elements in one shape. We need 9 of these landscape geometry elements for our city. If we were doing this in Cinema 4D, we would make our existing cloner a child of a new cloner. This can create a rabbit warren of cloners, as well as creating a heavy scene. Mesh is much more efficient at replication, as it can all be managed within one mesh network. To create our first row of landscape blocks, in the mesh1 tab, which we select by the outliner and then come over here, add a replicator node, which is here. Add replicator node. It is a good idea at this point to press the icon of 4 lines up here. This pulls up the new for Maya 2017 mesh editor, which gives a quick selectable overview of any mesh networks in a scene and what nodes each network has applied. We can now dock the mesh editor, so I'm going to dock mine here. There we go. We can now select a newly created mesh1 replicator node here. We are going to add 2 replicants, give them an offset position X value of 6 and 0 in Z. Let's just create another replicator node using the mesh editor. Select that, add replicator node, and this time our replicants again will be 2. But as we can see, it is replicating our first replicator node, and we'll set our offset position in Z to 6. We'll zoom out. By using this method, we can create a lot of geometry very quickly and efficiently using just one mesh network. We can now animate our first mesh network. Just as in Cinema 4D with cloners and effectors, we can use a combination of mesh nodes combined with fall-offs to animate the mesh geometry with a minimum of keyframes. For this specific geometry, we need the land sections to appear from nothing in a wave motion. First, we shall make the elements appear. To do this, in our mesh network, we need to add an offset node. Add offset node. Set the offset scale across all 3 elements to -1. As we can see, everything disappears. We need to create a fall-off to help control the visibility. Mesh can either create its own locator-based fall-offs or use polygon-based geometry objects. For what we need, a locator-based fall-off works best. In the fall-off object dropdown, which is here, right-click and press Create. And we see a spherical fall-off appear in the viewport, dissipating the mesh object. In the outliner, we can see a fall-off mesh 1 offset has been added. The fall-off object can be moved, scaled, or rotated like any object. As we can see here, we're moving. Let's move it to the center. There we go. And let's scale it to hide the rest of our geometry. Just use the channel box. There we go. We can now animate the scale attributes. Let's now right click and key selected. And we can see a small red line appear and one down here in the timeline as well. We're going to move to frame 30, and now we're going to middle mouse button our scale with our channel box selected down to 0. There we go. And then right click and key selected. As you can see, we now have an animation. Don't worry about the middle piece of landscape remaining clear. This is going to be covered by our tower object later. If the playback is too fast, we can right click and set our playback speed, play every frame, max real time. Now it's time to add some random noise to this animation. For this, select the mesh 1 object and add a signal node, which is a new name for the noise node. This animates the repro mesh elements according to the values in the noise settings, with no need for keyframing. We need more noise in the Y position and less in the X and Z position, so let's make the values here. 3, oh, not 3000, 3, 30, and 3. To animate the noise parameters, we can use a fall-off object we created for the offset node earlier to animate the signal node. In the outliner, choose the fall-off 1 mesh offset object, and with our signal node selected, go to the fall-off objects, and right-click and connect. Now we can see our signal node working with our offset node to create some noise as we move in and out. The only thing that is remaining to be fixed is the harshness that we have in the animation. In Cinema 4D, the delay effector is great for smoothing out motion or adding a spring. Thankfully, Mesh has the spring node, which is Mesh 1, add spring node. Now, as we move our timeline back and forth, we can see the spring node smoothing our main animation and adding a secondary bounce. We have now completed our first mesh network. The only thing we have to do is rename the mesh object to mesh 1 infill and do the same with the repro mesh and the created. We need roads to surround them. Let's unhide our road 1 geometry by Shift H. There it is. We can't see the road 1 object in the viewport very well as the mesh 1 object is in the way. So let's make a new group by going edit, create, empty group. Let's rename this mesh repro meshes and middle mouse button our repro mesh in here, and we will press Ctrl H to hide it. So let's select our road 1 object and again create a new mesh network. Again, we can see that's worked. And we also have a new MASH2 object in our outliner. It is best practice to rename the MASH network when it is created, as the nodes take on this new name. So let's rename the MASH2 network to MASH2 road main. In the MASH editor, we have MASH2 selected, so in our MASH2 distribute node, we can leave it in linear mode. We just need to change the number of points from 10 to 5 and change the distance x in the linear options, which are at the top, to 4. Oh, sorry, not x. Change distance 0 out distance x and change distance z to 4. And there we go, we can see our road. As we did with MASH1, we can use replicator nodes to multiply the amount of geometry we have within the MASH network. So let's go back to our MASH2 road main, add a replicator node, and set the number of replicants to 3 and the offset position Z to 2. There we go. If we unhide the repro mesh from our group that we created earlier using Shift H, we can see that there is a problem. Neither of the repro meshes are lining up. We can use a transform node to move and rotate and scale the repro mesh. So let's add a transform node to the MASH2 network. So transform node is here, add transform node. While we could use the position inputs to move the MASH2 repro mesh, we can create a locator and link that to the transform node to move it in the viewport. To do this, in the create menu, select locator, rename the locator MASH2 road main transform, and in the MASH2 road main transform, we're going to middle mouse drag into our controller null. Now that the MASH2 road main repro mesh is bound to the locator through the transform node, we can select the locator and move it to the correct position. So with the W key, I can now move my repro mesh like so. We need to create another replicator node, but we can do this again just by adding another one here. But here we'll just move it under so that we maintain the order, and we will put that to 0, number of replicants to 3 this time, and we'll offset that to 6. There we go. To animate this MASH network, we will use the same system as before and create a fall off. This time we will create the signal node first to create some noise. So let's add a signal node, and we're going to set the position x and z values to 0 and keep the position y at 5. Let's create a fall off. Scroll down and create, and we'll move that to the center of our geometry again. We're going to select our MASH fall off and just click on invert fall off. Let's make sure our time slider is set to 0, and in the scale options again, shift click, and let's scale those to 0 using the middle mouse button. Now we'll right click, key selected, move to frame 30, and we'll scale up to 30, and key selected. To hide the road elements, we need to add an offset node. So again, MASH2 road main, and add offset node. Let's add the fall off that we created. So we select it in the outliner, connect, and again we will just set our scale to be -1. So as we can see, as we scroll up, our roads appear. I just want a bit more rotation, so in the third value here, I'm just going to add 90, so that now when we scroll up, we get a slight bit of a turn, which we can see. There we go. And finally, just need to add another spring node.